Joint work with Jacopo Bassetto, who is also a postdoc at the University of Bologna. Uh, so, just as a very short motivation for this paper, we know that actually most migration spells are temporary. And even though migrants arrive in the host country, usually with a planned duration of stay, most end up revising their expectations as a result in changes in personal circumstances. And what we are more interested here as a result of changes in aggregate conditions in both their home and host countries. And these revisions to the internal length of stay can actually lead to subsequent changes in the socioeconomic behavior of migrants. So we know from previous research, mostly using theory and structural modeling, that differences in return plans can lead to differences in migrants' reservation wages, earnings, and career profiles. And so, what is it that we do here? Basically, we ask if social political events in the home country, such as terror or political violence, affect the intended length of stay and the labor market behavior of migrants in host countries. And basically, the mechanism that we believe to be here at play is that events in the home country work as shocks to migrants' location preferences. And so they change the attractiveness of the host country relative to the home country. We relate to very three broad streams of literature. So the first one looks at the negative event of terror events on individuals' well-being. The most known paper is this one by Clark et al. At the EJ that looks at the effect of the Boston Marathon bombing on the well-being of individuals in the location where the terror event happened. Then a second stream of literature looks at how changes in macroeconomic conditions in the home country, so usually has been used currency devaluations or changes in relative GDP, affect the well-being of migrants and the remittances that they send back home. Then there is a third very broad stream of literature on the individual determinants of return intentions and the effects of native hostilities, such as native anti-immigration attitudes, xenophobic violence, on migrants' intentions to stay. And so we try to contribute to this literature basically by looking at the effect of the terror events that take place in the home country on migrants' return intentions and labor market outcomes in their host countries. We are going to use terror events because we believe these to be largely unpredictable from the perspective of individuals residing in their home country and abroad, and because usually individuals would not really have any sort of affiliation or could possibly interpret these terror events in different ways. So it's unlikely that in the survey we capture people that actually support terror events or that have some sort of type of more extremist beliefs. So we believe that most people tend to see terror events as being negative. And this can be different when you consider some other sort of political events in the home country where people can have party or ethnic affiliation. And this is one of the main reasons why you have chosen terror events. Okay, so we use three main data sources. For the terror events, we rely on the Global Terror Database that record terror events with daily precision in all countries. We use the data set between 2000 and 2018. To measure return intentions, or rather the intentions to stay in Germany, we look at the German Socioeconomic Panel, which is a year household survey that is representative of the German population. And here we are going to use all waves between 2000 and 2018 and focus only on first generation migrants. And importantly, in the sub, we know the exact day in which individuals are interviewed. To measure labor market outcomes, we are going to use the German administrative data, which is the integrated employment biography. Basically, it's a data set on the full population of individuals who are subject to social security contributions, so that pay taxes in some form or receive benefits. And here we are going to look, as I will explain later, basically at unemployment duration and a set of wage, job, and firms characteristics. So one big question that we had is exactly how do we consider a terror event to be relevant? So I'm actually from Portugal, and I used to live in Germany. Now I'm living in Denmark. But let's say that a terror event occurs in my home country, and we barely have any terror events. So one terror event is likely to act as a shock to my perception of security back home. However, if you maybe come from Syria or Iraq, you're more used to experience terror events. So if there is one or two terror events in a given month, this is very unlikely to act as a shock to your perception of security. So basically, there is this idea that individuals from coming from different countries of origin, or even from the same country of origin, but at really different point in time, are going to have different reference points with respect to the level of security in their home country. And so basically, to try to capture this, we are going to consider a terror event to be relevant if the number of terror attacks in one given month is larger than the past 3-year average. So you can think of this 3-year average sort of as the reference point. And then we change this reference point to 4-year or 5-year average. Particularly for the administrative data, we needed to have really clear control and treatment group. And so what we did is that we include an extra criteria, is that these relevant terror events need to be isolated. This means that prior to this month where there is a terror event, in the 3 months before, there was no other relevant terror event, neither in the 3 months after. This is just to ensure that we have a very clean control and treatment group. Okay. So first, I'm going to show the effect of terror events on the intention to stay in Germany. And in this section, I'm going to use the German socioeconomic panel. And here our identification strategy basically is going to rely on this quasi-random occurrence of the date of the terror event in the country of origin relative to the timing of the sub-interviews and the characteristics of the respondents being interviewed in Germany. And we are, of course, going to test for this, but we do this because we believe that it's fairly reasonable to assume that these events at the country of origin did not really interfere with the implementation of the survey in Germany. And so, very simply, what we are going to do here is that we are going to compare the outcomes between individuals that are interviewed in the weeks immediately before a relevant terror event, which is our control group, with individuals that come from the same country of origin, have very similar characteristics, were interviewed in the same year and month, but were just interviewed in the weeks immediately after that relevant terror event. And this is going to be our treatment group. Here is our main equation of interest. So I denotes this intention to stay in Germany. Time are basically dummies identifying the period around the relevant terror event. So 1, 2, 3 weeks before the terror event, 1, 2, 3 weeks after. We use country of origin times year effects so that we are comparing the outcomes between individuals from the same home country who were interviewed in the same year, but some were interviewed just before the relevant terror events and some after. We also use month and year of interview fixed effects. So basically that we control for all month-year events that affect immigrants from all country of origins. We use federal state of residency fixed effects. And then we use a set of individual controls such as age, gender, years since migration, education, marital status, and children. We consider different bandwidths around the events. I will show the results using 90-day bandwidth because they are fairly robust. Okay, so first we want to check the validity of our identification. One of the concerns you can have here is that maybe following a terror event, individuals are less likely to wish to reply to the survey. And basically what we do here is that we plot the share of survey respondents. Here on the x-axis is the distance to the event, so 0 is when the terror event takes place. And you can actually see that the distribution of the interviews is fairly flat. Then because we also assume that these terror events occur quasi-randomly, the characteristics of the individuals being interviewed before and after the terror event should not differ. And this is what we do here. We look at gender, age, years since migration, married, education, and whether they have a child or not. And we can see that indeed they are not different. So looking at the first results. So basically here, the red line denotes the date in which a terror event took place. And to the left are the individuals interviewed before the terror event, and to the right are the individuals interviewed after that terror event. And what we can see is that individuals interviewed after a terror event are more likely to wish to stay in Germany. We then compute basically a summary of this. So we look just at the pre-post. Here in the first column, we only include the fixed effects, no individual controls, and then we progressively add individual controls. So in the second, we add gender, age, years since migration, third, marital status in children, and fourth, educational achievement. The results are fairly stable, and what we can see is that individuals interviewed after a terror event are 12.3 percentage points more likely to wish to remain in Germany. We then also look sort of at the intensity of these terror events in number of victims, in terms of victims that they have entailed. And so here in the first, we see if there were at least 10 individuals killed. In the second, if there were 30 or more individuals. In the third, if there were 50 or more individuals. And what this tells us is that as there are more individuals killed in each of these terror events, the effect on the intentions to stay in Germany become larger. So one thing you might be wondering is if one relevant terror event in a country that is generally very politically stable really has the same effect, has one more relevant terror event in a country that is generally politically unstable, which can be for other reasons besides experienced terror event, right? And the way we compute these terror events is only taking the general environment with respect to these terror events. And so to look into this, we use the World Bank Political Stability Ranking, and we group countries into three buckets. So the first one, we consider a country to be politically unstable if they are in the bottom 25th percentile of the political stability ranking. Middle stability if they are between the 25th and the 75th percentile, and very stable if they are above the 75th percentile. And here in column one, we look at the rating in the year just before individuals are interviewed. What we can see is that there are no major difference between these three categories. Okay, we do a series of robustness checks to try to convince you that our results are robust. And so what we do first is basically we assign a random day to all of these terror events, and we compute the event study plot I showed you here in panel A. And what you can see is that the effect is really concentrated around 0. We then repeat these procedures 300 times, take the coefficient and plot it here in panel B, and we see that it's really concentrated around 0, far away from our estimated coefficient of 0.12. To also ensure that we are not capturing some other type of randomness in the data, we look at outcomes that in principle we think they should not be affected by these terror events. So we look at individual worries about the future of the European Union, crime in Germany, economic development, and the environment. And we see that there is no difference between individuals interviewed before or after the terror events when we look at these outcomes. We then also show that there is not one particular country or one particular year that is driving our results. So basically, we exclude from our estimation one country at a time, 1 year at a time, and the results are fairly stable. We then also change these reference points that we use to compute to consider whether their event is relevant or not. And the results are very stable. We consider different bandwidths around the event, and the results are also stable. And now a new result, I didn't add the table, but some of the previous literature, mainly looking at the effect of terror event on well-being, used just a number of events in the days before an individual were interviewed, so with no clear treatment and control group, where events are relevant or isolated, so just really the number of terror attacks. We also do this, and we find the results to be robust. They are slightly smaller, but still consistent. We compute many heterogeneous effects. I will show you 4 that I think they are maybe the most interesting. So first, we see if the level of integration in Germany mediates the importance of terror events in the home countries. So you can think that maybe highly integrated immigrants are less likely to pay attention to events occurring in the home countries. Similarly, we also look at the location of core family members, which here we consider to be parents and children. So maybe if immigrants' core family is in Germany, terror events are less likely to affect their return intentions. We then also look at risk aversion, so we can think that probably more risk-averse individuals are more sensitive to changes in security conditions. And finally, we look at migrant groups. So we can also think that maybe depending on which visa individuals entered, which in a way dictates their how they are allowed to stay in Germany, this might also affect how they perceive these terror events. Here in figure 2, we proxy the level of integration in Germany by the commands of German, so by oral German. And what we see is that the effect is larger for individuals that are not so well integrated. So indeed, individuals that do not have such a good command of oral German are more likely to react to these terror events. In figure 3, we look at the location of the core family members. And indeed, we also see that individuals that still have the core family members back in the home country react much more to these terror events. Here on figure 4, we look at risk aversion. So again, as I mentioned, you can think that risk averse individuals value more security, and we do see that the effect is slightly larger for this group. And in figure 5, we look at these different migrant groups depending on the visa with which individuals entered. So we look at if they were citizens from a new country, asylum seeker, refugee, or if they belong to another migrant group. And actually, we don't find major differences. And I didn't put here, but we also break down by major region of origin. And indeed, in most cases, the results are fairly stable across regions of origin. We cannot really break down by country because it'd be difficult to estimate, but we aggregate by these regions and the results are stable. And then we also look at employment status, years since migration, gender, and education, but we don't find that actually there are major differences across these categories. I don't know if there are any questions. No? Okay, so basically up until now, I have shown that terror events in the home country can affect the perception of security and lead to an increase in the intention to stay in Germany. And now the question is if this update in the intentions to stay actually translate into changes in economic behavior. So as I mentioned in the introduction, there is a lot of economic theory that basically shows that differences in the intended length of stay can create different incentives to invest in human capital, which in turn leads to differences in career profiles. However, here in this setting, we are really looking at the very short term impact of terror events. And so if we were to look like at the completion of an educational degree or a change in the earning path or career profile, this actually takes time to materialize. So we needed a measurable indicator of economic behavior that reacts fairly quickly to changes in individual circumstances. And two such economic indicators as we can think of is the job search activity or the reservation wages among unemployed individuals. So one issue is that in the survey, when we restrict to migrants and to migrants that are unemployed at the time of the survey, our sample size would get really small. And so for this reason, we decided to go to the German administrative data. And here we are going to take the time to employment as our preferred indicator. So we look at individuals who fall into unemployment, and basically we look at their unemployment duration. Okay. So this will also mean that our setup will have to be slightly different because in the sub, so in the results that I preview showed you, we measure return intentions in a specific day, right? In the day that you're interviewed, we are measuring return intentions. However, time until employment can actually span over several days. So we will need to slightly change our identification strategy. So what we are going to do is that we are going to compare migrants who entered unemployment in a month when a terror event occurred in their home country with migrants from the same home country but who entered unemployment exactly 3 months earlier. And then for both of these groups, we are going to look at the probability of finding a job within 3 months. So this means that for the control group, we are measuring the probability of finding a job exactly up until the terror event occurs so that we ensure they are not affected by the terror event. I hope it's clear. If not, let me know. Yeah, okay. So here is our main equation of interest. So epsilon is our labor market outcome of interest is mainly going to be the probability of finding a job within 1 month or the probability of finding a job within 3 months. post-terror here is going to take the value of 1 if respondent from country of origin O has entered unemployment in a month when a terror event occurred in their home country, and 0 if a respondent entered unemployment 3 months before that same terror event. And as before, we are going to use country of origin time year 6 effect. So we are comparing migrants from the same country of origin in the same year. Year times month fixed effect. Basically, we are controlling for everything that can affect migrants from all countries of origin. And we use federal state of residency fixed effects. We use the same set of individual controls, but here we control for the log of the wage and the log of the firm size in the last job before unemployment. And importantly, we also show that individuals who entered unemployment in a month where terror events occur are really similar in terms of observed characteristics to those that entered unemployment exactly 3 months before.
So what is exactly the rationale of picking 3 months instead of some other number?
Sam?
So why 3 months and not 4, 5, 6?
I mean, we could do it, but because in the survey we are using this 3 months window, basically we wanted to do as comparable as to the survey section where we were using this 90-day. And the problem also in the surveys, as you start increasing the window, I think it becomes less credible that there is not something else going on. So we want to maintain as restricted, and ideally we would have exactly the same as we have in the survey, but because of this outcome that spans over several days, it's like if we are just taking those that are interviewed 3 months before, yeah. I will show you some robustness checks, but sure we could increase, but then it's always the risk as you increase more the window, there can be more things going on. And so we just decided to go with what we have in the return intentions.
Sorry, Teresa, to interrupt. Yeah. There is a question in the Q&A. If you observe an increase in the intention to integrate better after the terror event?
We don't. I mean, I just look at the intention to stay, and the heterogeneous effects are by the command of oral German. So I just find that those that are less well integrated are probably more likely to pay attention to what is happening in the home country. And so they actually update much more the return intentions. So the thing is also when you compare the means, these are the ones that maybe we're still wanting to go back. And so they are the ones that actually keep delaying. But we could not, as I mentioned, and the reason precisely as I mentioned here, why we are looking at the job search behavior is because this is a short-term setting and our identification strategy relies on this, because it was honestly very difficult to come up with a setting where you can really identify long-term when you have repeated events. And I mean, you don't learn German in 3 months. I didn't in 3 years. So I'm quite sure that no one does it in 3 months. And almost any integration outcome that you can think of, it just takes time, because it takes time until you even manage to enroll. So maybe it even takes 3 months until you manage to enroll in a course. So that's precisely the difficulty we had here. And so that we came up with this sort of behavior that reacts fairly quickly to changes in economic conditions. Where was I? I was here. Okay. So this a priori effect of a negative event in the home country on migrants entering employment is actually ambiguous. So on one hand, you can think that terror events lead to shorter unemployment durations in Germany. So if, as we discussed, we believe that terror events affect the perception of security in the home country, these terror events basically lead to lower expected utility in the home country. And if you think that migrants benchmark their reservation wage in Germany with what they could get in their home country, these terror events can lead to lower reservation wages and hence potentially shorter unemployment durations. Similarly, by affecting the perception of security in the home country, these terror events can lead to an increase in fear of having to leave Germany, either due to visa constraints or some economic constraints. And so this might lead individuals to actually increase job search effort, again, leading to shorter employment durations. You can also think of a totally different story that, for instance, these terror events directly affect the family members of migrants. And so migrants want to re-enter employment faster to be able to send money to their relatives. On the other hand, you can think that maybe terror events actually lead to an increase in unemployment duration in Germany. So also by having this sense of fear of having to return back home, migrants might become more determined to pursue a long-term career in Germany. So the present value of a job in Germany basically increases. This will lead to higher search efforts. However, it might also be that migrants actually become more selective about the type of jobs that they are willing to accept. So now they want to find jobs that are more stable or that offer more growth conditions. And so this countering effect can actually lead to longer unemployment durations. Another channel that you can think of is that if these terror events are really massive, even though individuals are not directly exposed, this can indeed lead to lower mental well-being. And if this effect is strong enough, it can lead to lower job search effort, such that we find, again, an increase in unemployment duration. You can think of a totally different story, is that if you think that, for instance, employers are aware of the terror events that are happening in all countries of origin, they actually might start discriminating migrants that come from countries experience terror events. And so basically there is going to be a decrease in the pool of job offers to these migrants, and this might lead to an increase in employment durations. So there can be more channels than the one I'm mentioning. I just mentioned some that I think that are more relevant, but of course this is not only the mechanisms that can happen. Okay, so here's the first result. So in column 1, we look at the probability of finding a job within 3 months following unemployment and the probability of finding a job within 3 months after falling into unemployment. And what we can see is that migrants that enter unemployment in a month when a terror event occurs in the home country are 1.8 percentage points more likely to find a job within 3 months when compared to migrants that enter unemployment during stable times. Then when we look at those that have found a job within 3 months, we are going to look at the characteristics of the jobs they found and at the characteristics of the firms they get employed. So in panel A, we look at job characteristics. Recall that we always control for the log wage and the log firm size in the last job before unemployment. And what we can see here in column 1 is that migrants who enter unemployment when a terror event occurs in their home country or find a job within 3 months have lower hourly wages. Then here in column 3, we see that they are more likely to switch from having a full-time employment contract in the last job before unemployment to a non-full-time employment contract in the job after unemployment. In column 4, we look at if they are more likely to change occupations between the last job and the first job, but we see that there is no difference here. In panel B, we look at firm characteristics. We don't see that they are more likely to change to larger firms, which maybe could be a proxy for more stable firms in a way. But we do see that they are less likely to change to firms that have a higher share of very high-skilled migrants. In column 3, we basically look at the share of Germans employed in this firm. So you can think of sort of migrant German composition, but we also don't find anything. And at column 4, basically we see that migrants are migrants entering unemployment in a month when a terror event occurs in their home country are less likely to be employed in a firm that pays a higher firm-specific wage premium, here measured by the AKM. So overall, these results suggest that immigrants who enter employment in a month when a terror event occurs in their home country trade off immediate job security for lower earnings and less productive firms. These results are robust to a series of tests. So we do tests that are quite similar to the ones that I've shown you in the survey section. We assign again this random date to the terrorist events and compute the coefficients and the distribution, and we find they're concentrated around 0. We exclude 1 year and 1 country at the time. We see the results not change. We other change this reference point that we use to compute a relevant terror event, and the results do not change. We have added 2 new tests. I don't have the tables here, but to avoid any concerns about, because we look at migrants that enter unemployment in a month when a terror event occurs, so maybe you can argue some sort of self-selection into unemployment. So we also use migrants that enter unemployment due to a mass layoff. And then again, we consider treated a month, an entire month where there was a relevant terror event. And so what we do is that we consider migrants that entered unemployment in that month when a relevant terror event occurred, but we only take those that fell into unemployment up until the first day when the first terror attack occurred. And then we do the same thing for the exact same control group, just first days in the month until the first terror attack occurred, and the results are stable. Okay, so we argue throughout that we think one of the main mechanisms driving these effects on labor market is the effect on return intentions. However, we also explore, as I mentioned in the theory section, the effects of other events that could mediate this effect of terror events in labor market outcomes. And here in column 1, we look at migrants that have family members abroad, and we see if they are more likely to, those that are interviewed after their event are more likely to wish to send money abroad. And if anything, we find a negative effect, although it's not significant. We also look at self-reported satisfaction with health. We find indeed a negative effect, but it's not significant. And here in the third column, as you can see, is a really small sample size, so only 575, because that's the unemployed people answering these questions we have. But we also find that there is a negative effect on reservation wages, which is sort of consistent with our story. Of course, it's a really small sample, so I don't want to rely on it too much, but just it builds up. Okay, so to conclude, I think I'm right on time. In this study, we have provided evidence that terror events lead to an update in migrants' internal length of stay in Germany. For migrants who are already more integrated in Germany and have no family members in their home country, these effects are lower. Then in the second part, I have shown you that for migrants who are unemployed, these terror events reduce unemployment duration. However, these same migrants basically trade off immediate job security for lower reservation wages and less productive firms. And that's it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. So now we will have the discussion via Kip.
I have to stop sharing. Sorry.
No, yeah. Let me just control me. You can see my screen? Yes. Okay, I mean, yeah. Great. Let me start. I mean, first, congrats on the R&R. It's kind of that made my work way easier because I know, kind of my comments have no value. Then you should
no, they always have.
No,
Don't worry.
But I mean, yeah, you have to. I mean, if I had an R&R and then different discussion, obviously I have to prioritize the R&R, and I mean, I'm kind of contractually obligated to respond to all those comments, right? And I cannot make any other changes, even if I wanted to. So that's. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think first, congrats on a nice paper. I think kind of really well written. So that's the first thing that I'm going to say. I believe the results. I think the empirical work is kind of really convincing. And I'm also kind of working in related areas. And I think I'm going to kind of use the way that you have kind of measured shocks in a kind of relative sense. So I think that's kind of really relevant for my own work as well. That's kind of fantastic. And I'm going to go kind of, really short because I guess the I've heard that the younger ones are kind of reputed to be very harsh discussants, so I'm not going down that route. I'm going to be kind of really mellow, and I'm kind of a very few comments. So just this, and all of these, of course, are at free disposal. So I think the first one, I think you have already done that, because you mentioned that, I mean, you have kind of replicated what these other papers are doing. So I think that's kind of really nice. And one other point that I was kind of thinking about, I mean, you discussed kind of the other literature that looks into, for example, the effects of economic shocks in origin countries. So I was just kind of, I don't know whether it's kind of possible or not, because these are kind of very different shocks. But I think it would be kind of nice to, it would be nice to kind of compare the effects across the different shocks, right? So kind of, I think that would be kind of, yeah, I think it would be kind of tricky to do. Maybe some, I don't know whether these other papers kind of use some kind of, I don't know, maybe some, shocks measured in kind of standard deviation terms. So that might be kind of one way to compare that, whether economic shocks of kind of a similar magnitude, whether that has the same effect as these kind of conflict events. I think that would be kind of nice, nice to have. And yeah, the third point is kind of, I mean, it's relatively minor. I was just thinking, I mean, as you kind of show in the paper, the baseline intent to stay in Germany, those are kind of more or less pretty high. I think close to 80% or something like that. And then I think I was, for example, I mean, as Syrian, at some point, even though, kind of according to your measure, it could be a kind of shock, but at some point, I think, that kind of, even that relative shock probably kind of ceases to be a shock, right? Because I can only, after a certain point, I know that, my country has been kind of very volatile. So even though there is a kind of, even a radical acceleration of these conflicts, that would probably not have any effect on my kind of intent to return or intent to kind of stay in Germany, right? So one way could be to kind of stratify the sample into different periods to kind of just see whether kind of the latter shocks have kind of smaller bite compared to the kind of earlier shocks. That could be kind of one way to kind of show that, especially given this kind of high levels of intent to remain in Germany. Yeah, so that could be, and for this, I think for these countries, I think Syria is kind of one example. I think Afghanistan could be kind of another example where there are kind of frequent outbreaks of violence and that kind of stuff. So that was kind of one minor comment. And the last comment was on kind of inference. I was just wondering, what do you think is kind of the unit of treatment here? Is it kind of the country? So I mean, if I'm kind of thinking about the experiment, of course we won't be able to run the experiment, but the experiment, or at least what I have in mind is that I randomly distribute these shocks at the country level and then see what happens to migrants from this country. Right? And as far as my understanding goes, that means that I would have to kind of cluster standards at the country level. I think for the employment results, you're kind of you're clustering at the country year level. But yeah, so that's kind of one question that I had, that what have you guys thought about that particular issue? Yeah, I think that's all. I mean, overall, I think fantastic. Again, congrats on the INR. Hope that gets through. But yeah, and yeah, so I think if you want to respond, I think just the last question, I'd be curious about kind of hearing your answer. I'm done.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll try to answer fast. So with the absolute shocks, yeah, as I mentioned, we do look at absolute attacks, of course, but the effects are smaller, but we are really considering like one terror attack in maybe this extremely unstable period. Then on the comparison with other kinds of shocks, we thought about it, but then it can also get in a really endless task. What we did now is that we looked at a different type of negative events. We actually used the Uppsala conflict database to look at armed conflicts. Again, the sample size gets really much smaller because then you're restricting to countries that are at conflict. The reason why I don't particularly like this measure is because when you're considering many countries, it can become very messy. So I can actually support political that my government is suppressing whatever insurrection that is going on, or the other way around. The violence can be because of a second or third or other party involved, and you can actually support violence from this party. The same thing if you think now the conflicts in Ethiopia, you can have ethnic affiliation. So I think it needs to be context specific, which is, for example, not the case with Ukraine and Russia. It's very clear you do not support racial violence. But in many cases, I find that with armed conflict, it's very difficult to really understand what can be going on if you need to have particularly knowledge. And that was our point with terror events. I mean, it's unlikely that we are capturing people with really these extreme views that you support terror events. So we kind of stopped here because we were really like, okay, we want to look at this sort of political shocks. Natural disasters, sure, that can be isolated, but how often do they happen? Is it because they physically destroyed things that you don't want to go back? You know, because they more likely are likely to destroy maybe your physical assets and so on. When do shocks cease to influence? I understand your point, but we did so much on this. So we showed by general political stability, we didn't find particular big difference. We showed by years since heterogeneous effects, by years since migration, by the type of entry visa that they got in, and the effects are really very similar across. So I don't quite know. I mean, again, it's a really short-term estimate. So even if you're used, you might think, maybe I'm going back in 10 years. And then a shock occurs and you say, no, you know what? Not even in 10 years, I'm going back. You know, again, these are short-term estimates and it is a shortcoming of our paper, but that's the best we can do at the moment. Maybe I come up with something better for another paper, but at the moment, that's it. And then on the unit of treatment, so now we actually change and we cluster the standard errors at the event level, which means that it's like, the country year and then the months, the 3 months before and the 3 months after. And then we are clustering now at this level, which because it's like where you have the treatment and the control. But in theory, like treatment happens in the case of the sub, it's country, year, month of interview, or 3 months, because we also consider those in the 3 months after. But for this reason, now we are clustering really at the event level. Everything. We change it. I didn't show the results with that, but they stay exactly the same. So there is no difference. So, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you. I think Francisca has a question. No?
Yes, I do. So first of all, thanks for a very fascinating presentation. I'm still a little bit puzzled by one aspect, namely I thought that the effects on employment would be driven not necessarily by intention to stay, but ability to stay in terms of your residence status. For example, because being employed often gives you the ability to stay for longer, or it gets you out of any kind of, like say you're up for removal from the country, then you can sometimes avoid it by being in a stable employment. So I thought this would maybe drive some of the results, but it seems like you didn't see any of this, and also the effects didn't really change by the type of immigrants. I'm wondering if you have any ideas why this is, or if you have looked deeper into it.
Yeah, I think that even though you fall into unemployment, you still have some months until you can find a job before you're kicked out. And so that's for sure. That's why when we list all the mechanisms, there can be more than one of these labor market mechanisms going on. It can be precisely you just have this fear of return. So you really want to find an employment faster so that you're not sent back, which then means that maybe you're willing to take in less productive firms. So we do find the same effect, but it's indeed, I would say, I think I didn't show in the graph, considerably larger for non-EU migrants that are somehow bounded by the residency. But this intention or ability is always in this very short term period, it's still precisely like you can extend your ability to stay by just finding employment. But yeah.
Yeah, so you're saying on the employment margin, you did see differences, because for the intention to stay,
no,
I
think for the employment, I don't remember if they were statistically significant. So they were a bit larger, but I'm not quite I don't remember now by heart if they were actually statistically significant. So
okay, interesting. Thank you.
So we have time for more questions. Okay. So
I was that convincing? Wow. No, I'm kidding.
we have one question in the chat.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Did you check if terror attacks in Germany had a negative effect on intentions to stay? Yeah. So I did not check, but because we control for month times year fixed effects, we are capturing this in our estimates. Unless you think they have a heterogeneous effect by different migrants. Yeah. I mean, I did not check it. Sure, you can think of, but then it is a little bit more complex because of the location and direct exposure and so on. And so by just controlling year times month, we got rid of this issue.
Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Teresa, for your presentation. I have a question concerning the aspect of safety and the perception of security. Did you think about approaching it using perhaps some other measures or other variables, such as the existence of ongoing conflict or estimation of death during conflict, population affected by violence, some other variables?
So I used the how many people died in these terror events, right? So there was the second table, and I do show that as more people died in these terror events, the effect on return intentions becomes larger. So I think that's more or less what you're asking, right? The intensity of these terror events, or because you were a bit cutted, so I'm not sure if I got everything.
Yeah, I just meant other measures than terrorist attacks or terror events.
Yeah, I didn't just use armed conflict, but again, like I think, which is a very specific context, I think that I would be super interested in looking into this, but I think you really need to look at the specific combination of country of destination and country of origin, because people can have different political leanings, ethnic affiliation, or beliefs that makes you support one or the two sides of the conflict.
True, yeah.
And people can support violence, right? So that's why we use the Uppsala to show that, okay, it's more or less, the effects are indeed a little bit smaller, but I think that you really need to think about a specific context. Although I think it would be interesting, but yeah, to use the classification. So if you have information on the ethnicity or pre-political leanings, and then see how people support. Yeah. That's all I can say, but we don't have that information, so I couldn't do it. Thanks.
I have two questions.
Yes.
First of all, great presentation, really interesting paper. My first question is, I don't know how granular the data is, but is there a way to know if like where you are from in the home country, like if there's like a proximity to a region, because there could be parts of the region that just isn't normally affected by terror. So I was wondering if that mattered.
So we don't have information on the survey side. So actually in the both in the refugee survey and in the Ukrainian survey, they ask which region within country you come from. We don't have that information, but and of course what we are identifying are average effects, but in countries that are very heavily affected. So I think the story is always more credible for those countries that either have almost no terror events or the ones that have many, because if you have many, likely it's reached your area or really nearby. And for those that have none, I mean, even from anecdotal evidence, when you start having terror events in Germany or in France, people started to get really worried and freaking out. Like,
Regardless
well,
of
I don't know if
location.
now in my small random town in a Christmas market, there's going to be a terror event. So you still can capture these things. I think the ones in the middle are the one where it's a little bit more tricky, but for those at the end, I think it still does make sense. But yeah. I think with better survey data, sorry, I was just thinking, I think with better survey data on this, on the locations and like your ethnic or political affiliation would be great. But yeah, that's what.
No, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. My other question was just if you also looked at the perpetrators of the terror attacks, like if it was a particular like known group versus more of an isolated lone dog incident. And maybe that played a bit of a role too about, you know, maybe it's similar to the political stability stuff you were doing, but I don't know if you could look at some of the named groups and more like organized groups versus more isolated incidents to see which effect might.
So I think
just to see what cause
looking
might
that
lead to
way, it would be
effects.
complicated because since we are looking at the number of terror attacks in one given month, you can have terror attacks by multiple different groups. So that works well when it's just one terror attack, which also is it's relevant. Or you can do like, say, there was at least one terror attack, or most terror attacks were by this group. Yeah, but this is, I mean, in the end, the problem of our measure of this relevant and isolated, and that's why I really show, because it limits us in a way, but also makes it this thing idea that I kind of like, that people have different reference points. But yeah, that's my answer.
And were you able to look at like actual return migration flows or just detention?
Have that in the, we are doing now that with the administrative data. So we look at people that leave the register. Again, within 3 months is really unlikely that you find anything, because like you don't pack your stuff and leave in 3 months. And in the end, we think that with regards to theory, what really matters is whether you intend to stay or not. Whether you actually stay or not, that's a different. Why? That's why you observe these people that, well, myself, I stayed 5 years in Germany. It was like, yeah, I'm going to leave soon after my PhD, so why am I going to learn German? And maybe if I had gotten a position after, I would keep staying. You say, well, but you have been here for 6 years. Why haven't you learned German? Because it all had to do with like, right, my perspective rather than the fact that I actually leave or not, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is another question in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Very different. Okay, so Lucille is asking, why would terror attacks be different in conflict? In the data-wise, one reported has terrorist attack. It could also be political, and then some people could also support it. This can partially be true, but most terror attacks, I would say most people would not support that you do some sort of like explosion or bombing, or that you drive a truck and kill innocent random people, right? Which is what it is mostly, these terror events. They tend to be less. When you have conflict, it is a different situation, because the way how this conflict intensity measures is basically, okay, now the government is cracking down on protesters, and these protesters are whatever blocking the roads. So you might think that it is justifiable to use violence in these cases, but the case of terror events, you're really using violence also against innocent people. And I think so, I don't have it here, but when you look at surveys, I think only people that are really on the extremes would support actual terror events that result in casualties for civilians. While once you look at these conflicts, you do have a lot of people that support violence as the only way of making change or whatever you are doing. So I do think that they are intrinsically different. In my opinion, you can tell me if you guys disagree, but that's
I agree. I just don't know how the data is built, and then what is classified a terrorist attack and what isn't, and if it could be based on like, I don't know, political reports, or like a government can report an attack as being terrorist, And in the Uppsala, it could be just like a conflict, and you don't like, why is one?
So I don't want to tell you the formal definition because I don't have it in the back of my head, but you do have like sort of a politically recognized group, because you also have international categorization of which groups are considered to be terrorist or not still, right? But it also has to do with the nature of how these events are committed, right?
Yeah,
like
then again, I don't know, maybe if you take Hamas attacking Israel, it in a way is
a terrorist event.
Terrorist attack, and you might have some people that support it also.
Support, yeah, sure, but this is
So
what
I
I'm
guess-
arguing. We cannot make it totally clean, but what we argue is that generally you have very few people that support these types of extreme violence against random civilians.
Okay.
But this is, I mean, if you also think, for example, in the case of the terror events in Germany by the Islamic State, like, sure, there are some people that also support it, but these tend to be a minority that are very unlikely to be captured by the survey, right? This is sort of extremists. And you don't expect to capture extremists in the sample, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm not saying that they don't exist. I'm just saying
No,
that
it's just that I was struggling with the argument you make on why it's hard for conflict and why it's not the same for terrorist attack. But yeah, I
mean, the
now.
people that support terrorist attack tend to be quite on the extreme. I don't want to call all extremists because there can be, of course, but they tend to be much more extremes than people supporting some sort of government crackdown or, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.